about some vocabulary for kinematics so far. We talked about scalar and vector, which are basically two classifications of types of values. Scalar is just going to be a number. It will always be expressed as a positive number. So, for example, time is always positive. There is no such thing as negative time. There is no direction with time. Time is just time. So that would be an example of a value that is scalar. Vectors are going to be values that also have a number because it's a quantity, but they include direction. So remember, we can draw vectors with an arrow. We can express direction with our numbers by either using positive or negative signs in front of our numbers, and we will have a specific positive means to the right, forward, east. When we start talking about vertical motion, it will mean vertically up towards the sky, and then negative is obviously going to be the opposite of all of that. So those two classifications were assigned to the words distance and displacement. Distance was scalar, displacement was vector. Now the reason why I'm reviewing that is because today's assignment or today's lesson is focusing on the word speed. Speed is directly connected to our distance displacement, and we need to know if speed is either scalar or vector because it will affect how we do our calculations and how we interpret conceptual questions. So let's just review. Distance, we said, was a scalar value, and this is when we have something that's moving, we are tracking how far it went. Period, end of story, okay? When we talk about speed, we are saying this is how far we went, and this is how much time it took us to travel that distance. The ratio of how far I went and how much time it took together is going to represent my speed. So, if we were to talk about that person running around the track, again, we talk a lot of sports in here. Do I have any people, I am asking a question, sorry, do I have any people who watch the whole NFL combine? We watch the football combine? No? A couple of you, okay. My husband likes to watch it. It's not really an entertaining thing to me. But one of the things that they love to show, at least on the TV coverage, is the sprints that the guys run. They love to show how fast they ran the whatever they're having them run. Usually it's a 40-yard run. So when we say that they ran 40 yards, well, that's the same for everybody. Everybody's running the same distance. But how much time does it take them to run it? Well, time is just time, but if I take that relationship between the two, that is now translated into my speed. So, speed is going to tell me how fast. Always, 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 this is a how fast. Notice that the definition says we're using distance and time. Now, if you look over here on the right side of the screen, I have another vocabulary word, and this is velocity. I have it in gray because we are not discussing velocity just yet. But you may have experience with the words speed and velocity being used kind of interchangeably. When we speak in everyday conversation and everyday life, we actually do a pretty poor job of using our words correctly. There are a lot of vocabulary words that people use incorrectly and nobody notices, probably because they don't realize that they are using it incorrectly. They don't know the details well enough to recognize that it was improper use. So you may have heard speed and velocity as being used in place of each other or as if they're the same thing. They're technically not, and we're going to save velocity for another day. So I want you in your physics student brains to classify speed as a separate word, and the definition says that it's distance divided by time. So we just reviewed that distance is how far, and it's scalar. So if distance is part of the speed definition, is speed going to be scalar or vector? Scalar. It has to be scalar by default. Now, as we progress through physics, you are going to find that there are words that depend upon other words. So you're going to actually need need to know the definition of both of those vocabulary words in order to fully understand its meaning, in order to fully and properly interpret whatever scenario and pull the information off, okay? So you may not have spent a lot of time studying vocabulary words in high school here recently. If you have not practiced that in a while, I would like for you to make an exception for this class, especially here in the first 2 chapters. Maybe make flashcards, maybe have a list somewhere on a scratch piece of paper where you keep up with what all the vocabulary words are and what they mean. Because your ability to know scalar affects your ability to understand distance. And now we're saying distance is part of understanding what the word speed is. And after we take this first test and we start the next chapter, we're going to take speed and we're going to use it to explain something else, okay? So please make sure you are taking time to learn these definitions. Speed is going to be measured in meters per second. And so we're going to look real quick at this equation down here and understand where that comes from. We already said in the previous lesson that distance is going to be measured in meters. So if distance is measured in meters and speed is the ratio of distance divided by time, time is going to be measured in seconds. And remember when we were doing our dimensional analysis, we said we're treating these units just like we would treat a number. So if I am taking meters divided by seconds, are those like terms? Are they the same thing? No, they're 2 different units. I can't simplify it. I won't rewrite that as anything. So my final answer just ends up being meters divided by seconds. Now, as we progress and learn new vocabulary, we will find that there will be time that we'll do algebra with our units. But for today, it's just meters per second. So speed is measured in meters per second. When we look at graphs in our next lesson, we're going to look at this relationship again and understanding that it's meters in the numerator and seconds in the denominator. For some of you, will be very helpful in understanding where to look on the graph for whatever question or variable the question is asking for. Or for some of you, it may be a nice reminder as to how to calculate a value, depending on what the question is asking for. So I want you to understand where the units come from. Over here on the right-hand side, V equals D over T. This is my first official equation for this class. V is going to represent my speed. Now, some teachers may choose to use an S for speed. I have never seen a formal formula sheet for any type of STAR test, or I don't recall in college either having an S on my formula sheet because it's normally not written separately. We just use a V even though we're using the word speed, okay? Equals D over T, where the D represents my distance and the T represents my time. So we're going to do a practice problem now, and I'm going to teach you the process for working through a word problem. But when we get to the part where we are labeling what all of our numbers represent, these are the letters we're using, okay? In my class, you are going to be asked to guess on every math problem. And I will remind you very often within the first couple of chapters, remember to guess on your math work during your test. I might just remind you, remember to guess on every math problem. So guess stands for a procedure. It doesn't mean just randomly pick a number. We're going to identify the variables that we are given in the problem. So in other words, we're going to read the sentence or read the story, and we're looking for values. We're looking for variables, for measurable information that we could use in our calculation, okay? Then we're going to figure out what exactly is the unknown. What is the thing that I'm supposed to be solving for? I will tell you, it's really hard to correctly answer a question if you don't understand what the question is. I have a lot of students that want to skip over this step, but then when they are done with their math problem, they got a wrong answer because they were looking for the wrong thing. I want you to actually write down for me what is your unknown variable. So the U stands for unknown. If we were in algebra class, this would be an X, right? So what is going to be the X in our math work? Then you are responsible for selecting the equation. For today, we have one formula to pick from. That is not your list, but if you look over here, there is a list of variables. You will have a list that you have to pick from. So the next step is pick the right equation. Now we're going to talk about how to pick it in more detail in a later lesson where we have to actually make a choice. Okay, so I'll review that again in more detail later. The first S stands for substitution. So you are starting with a formula that doesn't have any numbers in it. You are responsible for taking the numbers and putting them where they belong so that you can then do your math work. So notice that I've given you 4 steps and you haven't actually touched your calculator yet because you haven't done any math yet. It's not until you get to step 4 that it becomes a math problem. Now, you do the math work, assuming you set it up right. All you have to do is execute your algebra, and then the last S is you're going to write your solution or your final answer. And then I always like to remind kids we're using the proper number of sig figs and units. Okay, don't forget that. Every answer needs to be rounded for sig figs, and you need to put the appropriate unit at the end of each answer. And that is something that I will be grading for. How many sig figs? You'll remember we're using the least number of sig figs provided. In my class, we have that special Espinosa rule. Every answer will have at least 2 sig figs. Okay, we'll never go with 1. We'll always do 2 or more. All right, so let's do question number 1. It says, what is the speed of a dog that runs 5 meters in 2 seconds? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to identify what variables are given to me. So I see a value of 5 meters. If you just write a 5, you have not listed the value correctly. Remember, in this class, every number is followed with a unit. Because does it matter if it's 5 miles or 5 meters?
Yes.
Or 5 inches?
Yes.
Absolutely. And remember, I told you we want our unit to be in meters. If it's not, you have to convert it. So I am telling you, you are going to write a 5M every time for full credit. Now, I am suggesting to you, if you write a 5 and it's not followed by an M, but it's supposed to be your distance, make a note, or maybe right then, go ahead and do your conversion. Because you have to make sure it's in the proper units before you plug it in your math work, okay? Now, this right here is not correctly identifying information. I wrote down a number. Have I stated yet on my written work what that means, what that represents? No, I have not. So what I need you to do is I need you to write down the value, but you have to tell me clearly what variable is that. So I am going to say this is going to represent the letter D in my equation. Now, this step is super helpful come substitution time, which is step 4. When we get into more complex situations and we're dealing with more complicated formulas, or maybe it's a 2-step problem, or maybe it's some sort of situation where I've got to connect like 2 different main concepts together, that's going to be extra helpful. But if I don't build the habit now, when I get to those more complex things, I'm going to struggle because it's not already routine. So let's build the habits now, so when we get to those more challenging things, it's not an issue. 2 seconds is also a value that I was given. I always write SEC because sometimes my S's kind of look like 5s, and especially if I'm writing on my iPad, my handwriting's a little bit sloppier, so I like to write SEC, but you can put a 2S for seconds, and that obviously represents my time. Now, I know 5 meters, you know that's a distance. I know that you know that 2 seconds is a time. That's not why I'm having you write it. I'm having you write it because that's the proper procedure. That way when we have to do some critical thinking and manipulating, it's set up for us to make our life easier. Okay? This also earns you credit for telling me that you were capable of properly recognizing your variables. Because what if you put it in the formula incorrectly? Well, if I can say, well, at least they knew what they were, they just messed up on their substitution, then I can choose to give you a little bit of credit because you were able to do this part correctly. If you don't do this part correctly, then I won't give you any credit for that. And if you get a wrong answer and you don't show me any of the extra steps along the way, then you get 0 points. Period, end of story. Okay? The next step is my unknown. So what's the letter that I'm solving for in this question? I'm looking for the letter V. Now the question is asking me for the speed, but on my list, that's a letter V. That's my unknown. Now, here's where I teach people, not robots. So you decide what works for you. I personally like to use the letter that actually represents the variable when I identify my unknown, because I want to keep track of what I'm solving for, okay? Knowing that you guys are going to have 2-step problems, knowing that you guys are going to have to connect the dots from this concept to that concept, that would be my suggestion. I have a lot of students, at least in the first couple of chapters, they want everything to be an X because that's what they're used to seeing in math class, and that's where they feel comfortable. You do what you need to do. I'm going to say V equals, and then me personally, I put a question mark so that I know that this is what the question is asking me to solve for. This is what my final answer needs to represent. So you'll get more comfortable with all the little specifics for your unknown, but make it clear what we're solving for. The E, we only have one formula. Again, I'll review how to pick later when we have to pick, but guess what? If I am giving you credit for the little steps along the way, just simply writing V equals D over T earns you points. Very simple step. Now, the substitution part. This is why I make you write the list with the letters. We are literally trading out what the number is for where the letter is written. So, because I'm doing this on the iPad, I'm going to do this a little differently. I'm going to write my formula again because I want it to be very clear. You don't have to write it twice. This is just so you can understand why I make my list. In the formula, it says V equals. So I come over here to my list. V is the thing that I don't know. So I am not going to be able to replace that letter with a number. It's going to stay there because I don't know what that value is yet. D is on my list as being 5 meters. So I'm going to take this D and I'm going to replace it with the value that I have listed. My T is on my list as being 2 seconds. So I'm going to take this T and I'm going to replace it with the value that's listed. That's the purpose of the substitution. Now I have a math problem. What's 5 divided by 2?
2.5.
2.5. Do not write this for me as 2.5. Do not leave this for me as 5 over 2. We are expressing our answers as decimals. So this is going to be 2.5. And then my last step is to make sure my final answer is rounded for sig figs and it has the right unit. So we are going to go with a minimum of 2. What would my units be?
Meters.
Meters per second, because I did meters divided by seconds, and they don't simplify.